So this is my house. It's not much, but it's mine, and as much as I like to whine about it, it's really all I need and all I could ever need. I like to say I'm living the dream, and I really am. So what would I do if someone drove down my driveway today and told me that it was in fact their property? What would you do if that happened at your house? Recently, I asked my father-in-law about China's encroachment into Taiwanese airspace, and he asked me a similar question. For those of you that don't know about China-Taiwan Relations, basically each country claimed to be the rightful government of China, which includes the island of Taiwan. In a revolutionary war, the People's Republic of China chased the Republic of China off the mainland to Taiwan. So today, the People's Republic, i.e. China, thinks that they won the revolution and Taiwan is just a holdout. And up until the late 80s, Taiwan has seen itself as the rightful government of China. Today, they're two distinct countries, and Taiwan has come to terms with that, while China has not. And with China's position on the world stage, other countries are struggling with how to treat Taiwan. Anyway, recently China has been flying military aircraft over Taiwanese waters since Joe Biden has been elected president. And I wanted to know if there was a genuine threat or whether this was just sort of political muscle flexing, and how the people of Taiwan felt about it. Was there fear, or had they become desensitized to China's encroachment over the years? So I asked my Taiwanese father-in-law. He asked me how I would feel about a bunch of gangsters shooting guns off in my yard. Does it even matter whether they're serious or not? Either way, I've still got gangsters shooting guns off in my yard. Let's add another layer of complexity. What if that person who claimed my property, and let's understand that we've set the gangster metaphor aside for a minute. So what if that person who claimed my property was a peaceful Anishinaabe Indigenous person? In that case, they wouldn't be wrong. We could add a further layer if we move just a little further south. The Mohawks of the Bay of Quinte were promised land for their loyalty to the crown in the War of 1812. And when they showed up, by the time they'd packed up and canoed to their current reserve, there were already loyalist settlers there. And when they talked to the government about it, the government refused to do anything about it. So over the next 23 years, loyalist settlers continued to show up and occupy that land. Again, the government did nothing, and the result was that the Mohawks lost 2/3 of the remaining land. So if I lived just a little south of here, and a Mohawk person would be not wrong to show up at my door with Treaty 3.5, signed by John Graves Simcoe. And then our Anishinaabe person could show up at that Mohawk person's door. This also raises the question of where I would go. Could I go back to Ireland? Is Ireland even really my home country? My family has been here, depending which branch you trace, for 200 years. So is Ireland even really my home country? Why'd they leave in the first place? They were probably refugees of some sort, but be it economic, or maybe they'd gotten themselves into trouble, or maybe it had something to do with the potato famine. If things were good for them back in Ireland, why would they leave? So if my home isn't here, where is it? And with what money would I move? Would I get money back from my house? Certainly not the Indigenous person's responsibility to pay me back for my investment over the years. Would I be starting out in a foreign land from scratch? What about our theoretical Mohawk person? Would she go back to New York State? Would she even be able to? The other question is whether I'd get salty about it. I've actually thought about this over the years. I do carry a certain amount of guilt for occupying land that was stolen. I mean, anywhere else, if we buy stolen property, do we expect to get our money back if it's found out? But the stolen land is also by far my biggest financial asset. Without it, I'd be starting from scratch. I'm not particularly tied to any one place, but what if I was? What if I faced the prospect of losing all my investment in this place, in addition to having to leave a place that I feel some ancestral connection to? What if I found other people in the same boat and we started talking and organizing? The Taiwanese example is particularly interesting. It's thought that the indigenous people of Taiwan are actually from mainland China about 6,000 years ago, although linguistically they share more similarities with the people to the south. Various mainlanders have trickled over in the last 500 years, especially with the Qing dynasty and also the Dutch involvement when that became prominent. There was a period of Japanese occupation prior to and during the war. And following the war, mainlanders that were not okay with communism streamed over in droves. So, whose land is it? Are the indigenous people different from the mainlanders? How different? It's such a jumbled up history with people going back and forth that it really would be impossible to untangle. But really, it's Israel-Palestine that's on my mind this week. In Israel, the Jewish population had largely moved on. Jewish people were a minority among the Palestinians that inhabited the area. And until the First World War, it was the Ottoman Empire who controlled Palestine, but they'd sided with the Germans and thus lost control during the war. This is what Lawrence of Arabia is about, by the way. After the war, in the absence of the Ottoman Empire, the British were put in control by the United Nations, or the League of Nations at that time, until it was thought that the Palestinians could govern themselves. This was unpopular, and there were many revolts over the years. I suspect there just wasn't a lot of respect for Palestinian tradition or people, and that was fueling a lot of it. Following the Second World War, a glut of Jewish refugees streamed into the country, significantly shifting the demographics. And it was then that the State of Israel was established. The fact of the matter was the Palestinians were already there and had been forever. But they just lost their government. Something needed to be done about the Jewish refugees. And being that it was the very end of the colonial era, it was the colonial powers that were left trying to figure out the solution. It wasn't going to be a good one. So over the years, Israel's territory grew. The 6 Days War was a major factor in that expansion. So was the settlement movement, fueled by a lot of Zionist and nationalistic sentiments. Christian Zionists believe that Israel plays an important role in bringing about the apocalypse. So there's considerable investment financially coming from Christians, particularly in the U.S. From the Jewish perspective, every culture has nationalist sentiment, and those nationalist-leaning people in Israel are going to go and invest, even pick up and move to support the expansion of Israelite territory. Now, the Palestinians don't have clean hands in this either. How would it feel to have global forces conspiring to push you out of your home, which is the reality? And these are people who have roots thousands of years old in that region. So, to use my father-in-law's analogy, how would it feel to constantly have gangsters yelling at you in your front yard? And in a lot of cases with Palestinians, that's not untrue. Perhaps some people are going to just throw their hands up and leave, go somewhere else. That's probably what I would do. But others are going to dig in and fight. And my understanding is that Palestinians may not have much in the way of options in terms of relocation. Many who would move might not feel they have a choice, and thus have to stay and fight, whether they want to or not. All it takes is a spark to ignite a conflict in such an environment. We've seen that spark ignite before, and that's what's happened in the last couple of weeks to pretty dramatic effect. So let's change gears for a minute. This week is the Ascension. Jesus has done his worldly mission over the past 3 years. 12 people and more dropped their entire lives to follow Jesus during this mission. I don't know why the highway is so noisy today, but it is really noisy, and I apologize for that. Then, unnecessarily, he was killed by his own government at the urging of his own people. Much to everyone's surprise, Jesus does indeed rise from the grave, and he spends some more time with the disciples. But he doesn't remain forever. This is their mission now. He's taught them, and then they're to go to the rest of the world. Now, the Ascension story is one that's tough to wrap your head around. It's tightly linked with the resurrection, which people have trouble with. And the story itself involves Jesus getting lifted away on a cloud. Another tough thing to wrap your head around. But I think often getting stuck on that stuff distracts from the actual intent of the story. And that is that a better world is possible. And there's 3 points that the Ascension story wants to hit. That Jesus' message is trustworthy, where Jesus is, and to contrast Jesus with Caesar. What I mean when I say that Jesus' message is trustworthy is that it's possible. The gospel message tells us how truly and deeply how to truly and deeply change the world in a powerful and non-violent way. But that requires a lot of sacrifice. Jesus had just died through modeling this process to true peaceful change. Even if we believe the message, if we don't think that it's possible, why would we bother sacrificing ourselves? This story is meant to give us the assurance that we need to set ourselves aside. In terms of Jesus' physical location, I think that's probably more important to first century people that were asking, where did he go? But an answer to where Jesus physically is needed to be offered. And if he's sitting at the right hand of God, then it strengthens the argument that something new is happening, that we're in a new era where true change is possible. Now, contrasting Jesus with Caesar is very important. The Roman Empire was an amazingly advanced civilization, but it was cutthroat in getting there. Caesar is the one that says to look out for yourself first. Caesar is the one that says defend your land at any cost. Caesar's approach to life is the one that leads to all the conflict that we've been talking about today. Yes, it can achieve great things for a certain group of people, but at great cost. But if Jesus is in charge, things are different. If the man who sacrificed even his own life is in charge, then maybe we're no longer going to fight over whose patch of dirt is whose. First century people would have really only understood kingdoms and empires. That was just the reality of the time. So how do you envision a perfect world then? Well, when the perfect person is in charge. This is the message that the disciples are supposed to take to the world. First to Jerusalem, because that's just where they were and obviously needed it, and then to the rest of all time and space. And it's a hard message to wrap your heads around, but it's clearly the message that we need and the message they needed then. So today I've talked about empire, immigration, refugees, territory, colonialism, war, conflict, more. Europeans took the land of the indigenous people of North America, and now there's fear that the indigenous people might get a small piece of that land back, which is silly. China and Taiwan have been fighting an often bloody battle over who is the rightful government for a century on land once occupied by indigenous people. Jewish refugees tried to make a home for themselves in their traditional land, but that land was occupied by other people who called it home. And the whole thing was magnified by colonial forces trying to find solutions, as well as nationalist and Zionist sentiments. I could probably add any other conflict in history to this list, big or small. It is a hopeless tangle that has no good solution. If it was about who's in charge and what place, no matter what is done, someone is going to lose, and that fire will be fed rather than put out. But Jesus calls us to a different way, and the story of the Ascension is meant to help us have faith that it is possible. What way is that? Well, setting ourselves aside, choosing not to fight, choosing respect and listening. People are often uncomfortable with the idea that the world is a naturally sinful place. Original sin, total depravity, whatever you want to call it. But this is what it means, that there is no good solution. No matter what we do, someone is going to be upset, and if we're upset, then we're stoking the fire more. The gospel asks, what if we could set all that self-interest aside? What if we could recognize that we're not all going to get what we want in favor of building something new in the future together? That's what the gospel's about. That is what resurrection is. Dying to ourselves and looking forward to something new together. The Ascension Story is meant to assure us that that is possible. And we pray that it is. Amen.